Hello, everyone. I hope you're having a fantastic day. I am very excited about this Broker Minute because this is a topic that we've been talking a lot about for what seems like the beginning of time. And this is regarding buyer's agent compensation. As we all know, in the last few months, there's been a big change in the South Carolina forms, which are the forms that we use, so it is the forms that we're going to follow. And that is, there has been the removal of any direct broker-to-broker compensation. So whereas before, listing agent would list a property, take a amount for commission, and then the seller would agree for a portion of that commission to be paid from the listing broker to the buyer broker, that is no longer on the table. We all know that. What we haven't learned and we haven't really adjusted to is then how do we have the conversation around negotiating the commission that if you are as the buyer's broker are going to be asking the seller to cover your compensation. Because as we know, there's two ways that the buyer's agent is going to be compensated. Number one, from their buyer, which is in the buyer agency agreement. Your buyer agency agreement says, I charge X% for the services that I provide, and you are going to pay me X% at closing. Now, during the negotiation, I'm going to do everything in my effort to have my fee covered in the transaction by either the seller directly will be paying me as the buyer's broker, or the seller will pay you, Mr. Buyer, closing costs that you can then apply towards my commission. Now, we all know the cleanest way for this to happen is if you can negotiate for the seller to pay your commission as the buyer's agent directly and in full, so that way the buyer can use any closing costs that the seller chooses to give them in the negotiations to be applied towards additional closing costs. Again, it's all negotiable. What's happening is we're trying to negotiate the commission before we even have a contract. And what we need to understand is that the two parties in this transaction both have obligations that they've agreed to ahead of time, and so we need to make sure we're honoring that in the negotiation. The seller has obligations that they're going to pay at closing. They're going to be paying their deed stamps. They're going to be paying off their mortgage. They're going to be paying any commissions they have already negotiated with their seller, and any liens or any additional fees, attorney's fees that they have on the property. It's all listed in Form 310 of what could be their potential closing costs for which they already have an obligation to pay. Then we have the buyer who has the same obligations. The buyer has their obligations that they're paying, that they have to pay in order to close on the property. This is going to involve any closing costs for their loans, any inspections that they're going to be covering on there, and any commissions that they have already agreed to pay. The commissions, just like everyone else's obligations that the buyer has made or has agreed to pay to their agent, is just as much as a commitment as every other expense that both parties have in the transaction. So we need to get away from this thought process as the buyer's agent that I'm going to call ahead of time and find out what the seller is offering to your compensation, because quite frankly, it doesn't matter. You don't have a contract yet. So the best practice in this as a buyer's agent is going to be to submit an offer on a property with Form 120, the compensation agreement, that matches what your buyer agency agreement says you are charging your buyer. That way you submit it and say, Mr. and Mrs. Listing Agent, here is the offer on the property, here's the compensation form. This compensation form is asking for the seller to cover the fee that the buyer has already obligated themselves to pay. Now, that's it. Submit that offer, move forward. As a listing agent, when you receive said offer, because you've had a phenomenal listing presentation, you've explained to the seller to say, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, because we know 87% or 90% of the buyers that purchased homes in the United States are represented by a buyer's agent, we know that 90% of the time you are actually probably going to have a buyer's agent that is going to ask for you to cover their commission that their buyer has already obligated to pay. I know that sounds a little weird, but the reason they do that is because the money is all coming from the buyer, and they're going to have you covered out of your proceeds on their side. And what we should do, Mr. Seller, in this is we should understand that if this is an obligation that that buyer has already committed to, then let's negotiate the terms of the contract that help you cover that commission as well as anything else that they may be asking for in that. You don't have to accept it. You don't have to even counter if you don't want to. But my recommendation, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, is for you to counter on this offer if you are not netting what you want, the price of the property and closing costs on the property, but you leave the obligations that the buyer's agent is already, or the buyer has already committed to paying, and you negotiate the terms of the contract. When we start negotiating ahead of time, when you as a buyer's agent call a listing agent and say, what is your seller offering? Why are you negotiating what your commission is? You've already established your commission. Whatever the seller's offering is irrelevant at the time, submit it. Listing agents. When buyer's agents call and say, what is your seller offering? Why are you already telling them what the seller is offering? There is no agreement that a seller has made to say, I'm going to pay the buyer's agent X%. When a buyer's agent calls you and say, what is your seller offering? Your response should be, submit an offer with a compensation agreement that fits that your buyer's needs in this. I will present it to my seller and we will counter accordingly. That's how we have to do it now, folks. Moving forward, it's a little different. We got to let go of the old ways of doing things and understand that the buyers have their commitments on this side, the sellers have their commitments on that side. This is how negotiation's working. This is how negotiation should be working. We shouldn't be pre-negotiating commissions to be paid from one party to the other, which is why a lot of these changes were made. Of course, it's going to be confusing. Of course, you're going to have questions. Please don't hesitate to reach out anytime if I can help. Hope you have a great day. Happy selling.